Well, I wanted to start off by saying thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I'm so excited to speak with you. How have you been? How are you doing?
Good, good. Things are all good. Here's the paperback copy of Tigerland that came out. Have you seen it? Have you?
Yes, I've seen it. I'm
Oh,
listening to it on Libby right now.
oh, okay, okay, good.
Yes, I was actually listening to a little bit more this morning.
Okay, good.
To start, I wanted to ask you about, you kind of becoming a storyteller and a writer. You grew up in a time of really great cultural shifts surrounding race. Would you say that this influenced you into becoming the storyteller that you are now?
Yes, I mean, yes, uh, in the sense, Willow, when I was a 14-year-old kid living on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, um, the assassination of Dr. King in Memphis happened, and I was a kid, and all of a sudden, there was much anger throughout the community, and you saw tanks. You saw military tanks, and you saw National Guardsmen surrounding the structures, the homes where you as a kid lived. And so it was like, because you were Black, you were suddenly in a war zone. And you had to ask your parent, why is this happening? Why are tanks and guns being pointed at us? We're just trying to get to school. We're just little kids. And so that that traumatic experience, I think, would scar children anywhere in America, in Tokyo, in South Africa, anywhere. A situation like that would scar a child. So when I decided to become a journalist, it seemed like these sort of conflicts opened the door to telling significant stories about the history of the country. So I kind of merged history and storytelling.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's your story to tell. Did it feel like it was almost you had to tell it for other people to know?
Uh, well, Willow, let's just take the story Tigerland, okay? Tigerland happened, the year after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And life goes on, and Wil Haygood heads off to college. Then I moved to New York City and work in retelling, and I'm a flop in retelling. And so then I look in the mirror and kind of realize that I have to find a career that I can anchor heart and soul to. I have to really latch on to something. And so then I decided to become a journalist, and I'm a national correspondent and a foreign correspondent. And I know a little bit about this high school story that happened in Columbus when I was a kid. And I'm writing my own books, traveling, I'm writing my own books. And I keep waiting for somebody to go into Columbus and to go to East High School and to start researching this great story of an all-Black basketball team and baseball team that wins 2 state championships in the same year. I mean, it's like Hoosiers and Friday Night Lights and Remember the Titans all rolled into one. So I'm waiting on, some fellow journalists to go and write and tell this great story. But they didn't. They did not. So I said, all right, I guess that the literary gods are telling me, Wil Haygood, you have to go write that story if you want it done. And so 50 years after the fact, when I start knocking on these athletes' doors, they all get tears in their eyes. They all say, hey, we just didn't think anybody cared about this story. Wil, thank you for being here, for wanting to tell it. I mean, these guys, they won 2 state championships in the same year, a couple hundred days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And their spiritual advisor was somebody who knew King himself. So I just said to myself, wow, what a story. And so I called my editor in New York and we started talking about it. And by the end of my pitch, he said, so when are you going to get started? And so that was how that book, that particular story, had this childhood link to me, one might say, and that sort of set me on my journey.
I feel like at least a few of your stories are like that, where you're telling a story that nobody else has, I guess, thought to tell or thought that it was worth it. I just listened to a similar talk with a school about the Butler, and you were saying how you found Eugene Allen and kind of the beginning of that story. And that was so moving to me, how you find these pieces of history that are untold and need to be told and deserve to be told, and you do that so eloquently. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
And I mean, I guess Eugene Allen and your book for Tigerland and those athletes, those are a little less well-known people in general, but for people like Thurgood Marshall and Sammy Davis Jr. and people of that stature, I heard that you said you find subjects and characters that you think you'll enjoy spending years with. What kind of characteristics do you look for when you were saying that?
I tend to want to write about people, Willow, who I admire, who I look up to, and subsequently these become people whose stories need to be told. I mean, you can't help but fall in love with athletes whose mothers were maids, okay? I mean, you can't help but fall in love with this White House butler who had never told his story and who didn't know if his story was worthy of being told. And yet you have a British movie called Remains of the Day. And I don't know if you heard about that, but it's a movie that starred Anthony Hopkins, and he played a butler. And it won all kinds of awards. And then you have that TV series, what was it called? Oh, about the maids and butlers in England. What was that called?
Downton Abbey or Handmaid?
Downton Abbey. Abbey. Yes, Downton Abbey. And so then you have this Black butler who's worked for 8 presidents. I mean, it's unbelievable. Who endures and lives to see the country's first African-American president elected. Now that, as they say, is much better than fiction. And so I think there's just this engine, inside of me that churns and churns and churns to find the untold story. Even in newspapers, I would walk into the newspaper room at the Boston Globe or at the Washington Post, and I would always suggest to the editor the story that everybody wasn't doing. I mean, that's the story that I wanted to do. And so I had been on a book leave and came back, and Obama was running the first time in 2007. And my editor said, "Will, follow him around. Go get on the campaign plane and just look around and just figure out something to do that's a Wil Haygood story." That's literally what he said. He said, go out there and bring me back a Wil Haygood story. Something that I know I won't look in the New York Times and see, or the LA Times and see, or the Associated Press and see. Just something unique and original. And that's what I did. That's what I came up with. I said that he was going to win, and that I wanted somebody who was African American, who worked in the White House before the civil rights bills were passed, and the rest is history.
That is amazing. And after watching that video, I saw you ended up finding him because somebody suggested him, and you had to go through a bunch of phone books, right?
Yes. It was very hard to find the butler. And I got a phone call out of the clear blue from somebody down in Florida who had worked in the White House before, and that heard that I was looking for somebody who worked in the White House who was African American, who had to work under the system of segregation in this country. And then this person who had called me from Florida said, there was a man I worked with named Eugene Allen who worked for 2 presidents, and you ought to find him. And they didn't have his phone number, but they told me that the last time they saw him, he was coming out of a reunion event at the White House, and he had hopped into a taxi cab. So I put 2 and 2 together and said, okay, if he hopped into a taxi cab, that means he was going home, and he probably didn't live too far from the White House. So I got the phone books for Maryland, for the closed communities near DC, Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And I would call every Eugene Allen, and sort of gaps of 4, like I'd look in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I call those 4 Eugene Allens, then DC, and then Virginia, and I keep going back and forth until about the 57th phone call, I found him. I found the man who had worked, but he said, "Hey, let me correct you, young man. I didn't work for 2 presidents. I worked for 8. And I about dropped the phone, as you can imagine. I mean,
I'm sure that's exactly what you wanted to hear.
Yeah. And that was a Wednesday. The election was the following Tuesday. And so I sent a photographer. That was a Wednesday when I reached him on the phone. They had a doctor's appointment that Thursday. And so Friday was when I went to interview him and his wife. In this, and then of course, Obama wins. And on the night before the election, his wife dies very tragically. That was, I don't know if you've seen the movie. Have you seen the movie?
I haven't. I'm going to watch it when they show it here.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine being a journalist?
Oh my God.
Story, and then having all these Hollywood people call you after the story comes out, and then find out few years after that, let's see, the story came out 2008, and I started getting the phone calls right away that Hollywood wanted to make a movie about it. And then, these Hollywood producers fly out to Washington, D.C. to see little old me, and then I choose the company to go with, and we make the movie, and it comes out in 2013.
That's amazing. And so deserved. I really do think that was beautiful. I was watching when you were telling about how Eugene Allen's wife had passed, and then I think you said 15 months later he passed away too. Just to be able to tell his story and make it so famous and well known, I think that was beautiful. I cried while watching the video. I was like, oh my God, I'm so glad you were able to do that.
Yeah. Sometimes I literally wake up from a nap or from, sleeping, and I'll say to myself, my goodness, 15 months after I first knocked on their door, they were both gone. They were gone. Their story was gone. They were gone. And their son, they only had one son, Charles Allen. He still lives here in Washington, D.C. He always reminds me of that. He always says to me, my goodness, Will, you really gave me a reason to revere my dad even more than I had. And because my dad, because of that story, became this worldwide figure. I mean, Willow, there were stories about him in the press in Tokyo, in France, in Germany. The world over. I still have to pinch myself, like, what? He was an amazing figure. Willow, but I think too, it goes back, to the very first question that you asked. I was a little kid. There were tanks around me. I was curious. I wanted to know, why is this happening? You know what I mean? And nobody could effectively give me an answer.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this, you know what I mean? Why are me and my classmates being, harmed by this? Why is the United States of America surrounding our living community with guns drawn, and why has Martin Luther King Jr. been assassinated? He was all about nonviolence and peace,
Mm-hmm.
and yet he's been assassinated. Why? I wanted to answer that, just like I wanted to answer the story about, how did these athletes make history in 1968, 1969? How did this butler continue to love every president who he worked for at the White House, and work so hard to make them comfortable as first families?
I think that's a really important story to tell. What would you say was the most difficult biography to write?
Yeah, they're all very difficult.
Yeah.
Probably the one about Sammy Davis Jr., because so many people thought they knew who Sammy Davis Jr. was. They thought that he was, just an entertainer, somebody who didn't care about civil rights, about human rights. Thought he was a non-serious person. And I literally moved out to Los Angeles. I set up camp when I worked on that book, and I interviewed more than 200 people because, I just kind of sensed that there was a serious figure in that 5 feet 9 inch frame. And when I interviewed Harry Belafonte, he said to me, he said, the secret weapon in the civil rights movement will, when somebody would be arrested in Mississippi or Georgia or Florida, Martin Luther King Jr. would say to me 2 words, "Get Sammy." And that meant to telephone Sammy Davis Jr. because he was one of the few Black entertainers who had a lot of money at the time, and he would send bail money for students who had been arrested. And Harry Belafonte, who had this very raspy voice, said to me, "That's the part of the story that nobody knows about. And you must tell that. Sammy Davis was a secret weapon in the entire civil rights movement and nobody knows it." And so that really became, a very important part of the book, to unravel the hidden life, you might say, the hidden heroic life of Sammy Davis Jr. And so many people thought they knew Sammy because he wrote a memoir called Yes, I Can. It came out in 1966 or so. And, it was only the part of the story that Sammy wanted to tell. Right. It wasn't the real story about his life. And so, I came along all these years later, and I got people who had never wanted to talk about him, who thought it was time to talk about him, honestly and truthfully, and they did. Such as Harry Belafonte, such as, Jerry Lewis, a lot of people, known and unknown, finally opened up about Sammy Davis Jr.
Right. Well, I guess at the time where he put out his memoir, he maybe wanted to talk about the rest of it, but realistically couldn't. Like, he still couldn't speak about that type of thing. That's amazing that you got to.
Yes, very amazing. One other thing about Sammy Davis that's just a quirk of life, a quirk of history, is that if you're doing a book about somebody famous, right, like Thurgood Marshall or Sammy Davis Jr. or Sugar Ray Robinson, you look for the obituaries of their parents in the newspapers because those little nugget stories can tell you a lot. And so I found the obituary of Sammy's dad. I couldn't find it of his mother. And I was looking all over in a lot of newspapers everywhere. And I finally called somebody who had known Sammy's family, and they said, "Will, the reason you can't find his mother's obit is because she's still alive. She's 94 years old, and she lives in New York City." And so I tracked her down, and I went to New York and sat with the mother of Sammy Davis Jr. Now, Sammy had long been dead at that point. He died in the 60s. And there his mother was, who left Sammy when he was a child. So you can imagine all the trauma behind that, and all the stories that she had to tell me. And so family stories are very fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that really goes to show, as much as you think you know of anybody, a famous person, somebody you're close with, there's always more to find.
Yeah, yep, true.
Is there this might be a hard question, is there any one biography that you're most proud of, or are they all like children where you're equally proud and loving of them?
There's a quote from James Baldwin. There's a couple of James Baldwin quotes on my wall that I'm looking at. And one, a writer's best book is his next book. And so I'll be able to answer that question after my next book comes out. I have a book that'll be out, looks like later in the year. And Willow, it's another story that nobody has sought to tell. I mean, it's sort of two halves, you know. It's a story about aspect of history that we think we know, and another aspect of history that we definitely don't know. I've been working on this book for 4 years.
Gotcha. That's so
And
exciting.
yeah, yeah.
How long do you usually work on books?
Somewhere between 4 and 5 years. The Sammy Davis book took 5 years. The Thurgood Marshall book took 4 years. I worked on Tigerland, took 3 years. So somewhere between. It generally takes about 4 to 5 years.
That's so exciting. I'll make sure to look out for it. So it's been done and finished for a while, for a bit?
No, I actually just finished it.
Okay.
It's going through the edits right now as we speak.
That's so exciting.
Going through the editing process. And is all I can tell you about is that it is about it's about war.
Okay.
It's about war. It's a book about a war that America was involved in.
Gotcha. Okay. How intriguing.
Yeah. Yeah.
As I said, I'll make sure to look out for it. Going back a little bit to you in adolescence, I guess, you said you always enjoyed basketball, which was part of the reason why you were familiar with the story of Tigerland and what kind of brought you to that. As I was listening to it, I remember you said that basketball was almost a pathway to freedom for young African American men. Did this have anything to do with your passion for it? And how did that bring you to talking about it, I guess?
One of the strange and heartbreaking things in my life, Willow, was that I wanted to play basketball very badly. And I kept getting cut. He didn't make the team. And so in the 10th grade, I got cut from the basketball team. I got cut during tryouts. And I went and asked the coach, Scott Geiler. He lives in Texas now. I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago. I asked him if I could have a second chance. Now, how many people who get cut from a team go ask a coach for a second chance? Not many. Not many. And so he gave me that second chance, and I ended up being on the team. And so then when the coach at East High School told me that I wasn't going to make the varsity in the 11th grade, I said, well, I'm out of here. I had to go to another school that had a sorry basketball team so I could make the team. And so I went to a school on the west side of town called Franklin Heights High School, and I made the varsity. And then when I went to college, before I entered Miami University in Ohio, I wrote the head basketball coach. And now I didn't have any scholarship offers. I was on the varsity 11th and 12th grade, but I never started. Anyway, I told the coach at Miami of Ohio, Daryl Hedrick, it's amazing, Willow, that I'm still in touch with all these coaches who didn't have faith in me until I showed up.
You persevered.
Yes, I did. And I ended up making the Miami University junior varsity basketball team as a walk-on. Now, you have to know that there are like 10,000 students at Miami, maybe 150 players who try out, and maybe only 6 walk-ons make the team. 6 walk-ons out of 14 members of the team. All the other guys are on scholarship. And so the fact that I made the team at a big school was, it was important. And I think, well, that drive from basketball, from being told that I wasn't strong enough, I wasn't tall enough for something, I think that, that drove me, still does, as a writer. I'm constantly on a search. I mean, what do you mean I can't tell the story of Sammy Davis Jr. just because everybody thinks they already know the story? Not true.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you mean that this story about this all-Black segregated high school is not as important as Friday Night Lights? The hell it ain't. It's even more important. I mean, because they won 2 state championships in the same year. If those had been white athletes, they would have been on the cover of a box of Wheaties. They would have been. That's just the story of America. And it's a great country, but it also has a very tortured history. And we have to tell that history, why do you think people try to ban books? They try to ban books because they don't want the truth to be told. And it's the height of ignorance to ban books. I mean, that book's doing nothing to you. That book is simply giving you knowledge.
Right. If you don't like it, don't read it. It's okay.
Right. Don't try to force somebody not to read a book. I mean, that's like somebody trying to force you or somebody else, not to go see a certain movie.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to go see a French movie tomorrow night, well, go see that French movie tomorrow night. And so, yeah, that's what it's about. My whole career, I think, has been about answering questions that people thought were unanswerable, or questions that people thought were not important enough to answer.
When did you start? I know before you had a whole career in journalism. Were you writing books while you were also a journalist?
Yes. How it's done in the newsroom, you have to establish yourself. And you have to become so good that the newsroom doesn't want to lose you. And so if you get to that point, then you have the flexibility to go to the editor and say, hey, there is an idea that I have, and I have an agent in New York, and they think this can be a book. And I gave the book idea to my agent, and I want to have a leave of absence. If you would be so kind to grant me that leave of absence to go and write this book. And so if you have established yourself well enough inside of a newsroom, the editors will say, yes, you can go for a year, but then we want you to come back. So, so I would go do my research for a year. Then I would go back to the newsroom to do stories. And if I wasn't finished with the book, which I wouldn't be finished with the book, I would have to go ask for a second leave. And so that's how I know friends of mine say, wow, how did you write 10 books, Will, and have this ongoing newspaper career as a foreign correspondent and a national correspondent? It just takes a lot of, you have to juggle the 2 jobs. You have to get a leave of absence, and I've been very lucky to get some, and some very wonderful fellowships, like the National Endowment for the Humanities and the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. Those are fellowships that are, very hard to get, highly thought of, and they help you as a writer. with money, you know. So
That's important.
yeah, yes.
How would you say that writing as a journalist compares to writing as an author and your, I guess, your method with it?
Yeah, that's a great question because, you know, the newspaper, you know, and expects a certain kind of story. Okay. You know, they don't expect you to put yourself into the story. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
You know, or your voice, but, you know, I have a writing style that's, you know, that's sort of different, sort of musical, sort of jazzy, you know, it's different. And one editor told me early in my career, actually on my second book, he had said, Will, you have to get inside the skull, skull, the skull of your subject matter. So you can't just like tell me about Sammy Davis Jr. and where he went and the concerts that he gave, you know, on, you know, all those facts on top of each other. You, as Wil Haygood, have to impart your own view. What do you think about Sammy? You know, what do you think about Thurgood Marshall? You know, once you marshaled all of these facts, then you have allowed yourself to be the, how can I put this, to be, you know, to be the leader about telling the world how they, uh, you know, might want to view Thurgood Marshall or might want to view Sammy, you know. And I think that editor, Peter Davison, was trying to tell me that you have to have the courage. If you're going to spend 4 years on the book, it can't be a hundred newspaper articles or 1,000 newspaper articles merged together, synthesized together. It has to be your knowledge, your muscle has to go into that book. Uh, yeah. Uh, you know, for instance, the first line of Tigerland. Now, these guys never would have said this about themselves, but the first line in Tigerland is they were poor boys wedged into the turmoil of the nation at war and in the midst of unrest. They were the sons of maids and dishwashers and cafeteria workers, poor as pennies and too proud to beg, but not to ask or borrow. None of them would have ever said that about their own lives because they were living it.
Mm-hmm.
They were living it. They didn't necessarily know that they were poor as pennies, as Wil Haygood would come along and write years later, but there was a big event, that the mayor hosted in my hometown when the book came out, Willow, and and the players, some still live in town, some live, some live elsewhere in Texas and Florida. They all flew back for this event in 2018, and one of the players said, "Will, you got it. You understood all of us in our families." And he said, "I don't know how you did it, but you got it." And it's just moments like that that just make me feel so good.
Right, because that's exactly what you want to hear as a writer who's doing biographies on people. Yeah, that's really great to hear. I think you really get the nail on the head for almost like every story you tell. You putting your perspective on things, it's a really well-rounded and a perspective that, as you said, like people want to follow and they think, yes, this makes sense. I agree, and I think this is a great way to think about things. When you were doing um, more in your journalism side and covering really like history changing events like the Nelson Mandela, his release from prison, as Obama rose in popularity, and then covering Hurricane Katrina's aftermath and that storm in general. How do you navigate covering those complex stories and kind of finding your perspective on it?
I think if a newspaper sends you out on the road, to do these, very complex stories, I think that they're sending you out there for a reason.
Right.
I think that they're sending you, whoever you might be, out there because they know that, you're able, to find people to talk, or to be patient, and to sit on somebody's front porch for an hour, to wait for them to come home. I just, I think that it just takes, the right amount of stamina, and the right amount of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Empathy is very important to me because I saw so much pain growing up, and I think it helps to understand people under stress, people who are in, very difficult circumstances. When I covered the hurricane for the Washington Post, I was down in Louisiana for 31 straight days. It was a very hard story, very difficult, story to tell, but it was a very important, story to tell. A big motif of my career has been, linked to that word that you first used, storytelling. I don't know how much, you can teach storytelling. I mean, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like, some singers walk into the studio, and they just have a talent, and I knew, when I was on newspapers, people would read a story of mine and they would always say, wow, you should be writing books. And I never knew, what are you talking about? I mean, why are you saying that? And they would say, it's just because the way you write. You put people there. I, as a reader, can feel what's happening in the story. I mean, I have tons of letters before I even wrote my first book. And those letters are about, those letters are from readers just saying, when are you going to leave newspapers and start writing books? And I didn't know any authors, and I didn't know how I would get into the book writing business, but I went down the Mississippi River for the Boston Globe. It was the 150th anniversary of the birth date of Mark Twain. Okay. And I went the entire length of the Mississippi River with Stan Grossbell, who's a photographer at the Boston Globe. And we simply retraced, the whole 2,000-mile journey on the Mississippi River, and, we traveled by raft, by boat, by car. And anyway, and I wrote a long magazine article that took up the whole issue, and it was called Two on the River, TWO. me and Stan, me and the photographer, writer and the photographer, Two on the River. And it came out on a Sunday at the Boston Globe. And on Monday morning, I get back in the newsroom after after it had come out, and my phone rang, and it's Peter Davison from New York City. He says, "Hello, I'm looking for Wil Haygood." And I said, "Speaking." He said, "Hey, my name is Peter Davison. I'm an editor at Atlantic Monthly Press here in New York City. And I just read your article, Two on the River." And of course, Atlantic Monthly Press was Mark Twain's publisher. And I want to know, have you got enough in your notes left over to write a book? And I went, ah! I said, "Yes, sir. I have enough to write 2 books." And so that was the beginning of my career, writing books. It's been 10 books now, and I don't think I would have known how to, how to kick open the door to, to a career to write books, unless somebody had called me. I don't know, maybe I would have found my way in, but, he called me. And then after that first book came out, it was an oversized, book with a lot of photos, but, it also had a lot of my prose, of course, And he called me to his office, and I don't know, I thought I was in some kind of trouble or something. And he said, "Okay, so what next?" And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Your next book." He said, "You are on this earth to write books. So what's your next book?" And whoa, I said, "Whoa, wow, and so I was off and running.
That's amazing. What a phenomenal story of, I think everything happened the way it should have. I think you, as you said, you were meant to write books. Um, yeah, I think you can teach, oh, your camera went away. Are you still there? Oh.
Yeah. Yes, there we go.
Like you said, I think you can teach the fundamentals of writing, but the storytelling nature is kind of, I don't know, I guess in some people more than others. And
exactly, you're exactly right. I mean, yes, it just is. I mean, my sister says that to me all the time. She says, she'll say, even when you were starting out on newspapers, a story that you might write about a flood or a fire, it always had like a story angle, like a storytelling angle to it, And so for some reason too, Willow, I knew that, in order to keep a reader interested, in a 400-page, 300-page book, a 400-page book, that you had to keep telling stories.
Right.
I mean,
right.
You had to keep telling stories. You know what I mean? Sort of like, scene to scene to scene in a movie. It's very important to keep telling stories to keep a reader's interest. So that's why I went intentionally, applied to 2 newspapers. Well, I mean, I applied to the Boston Globe, and then the Washington Post, snatched me up from the Boston Globe after 16 years working at the Boston Globe. And the Washington Post had, noticed my storytelling, energies, I guess. And always went to newspapers like the Boston Globe and the Washington Post that had a lot of space, where writers could write long feature stories, and and then I sort of told myself, okay, if I'm going to transition to books, then that's like me writing a lot of feature stories on top of feature stories on top of feature stories, and then you have a book. It's not as simple as that, but if I told myself that, I wouldn't be so fearful to write books.
Right. It seemed manageable. You've done that a million times.
It's manageable. Yes, I have. Yes, you're right. It's manageable. I mean, yes, it's manageable. If you tell yourself, you know.
I think that's a great way of looking at it. So just to wrap up, one final question. I have to ask, what is some advice you think you should give or you could give Bridgewater College students as they're kind of going out, graduating, and beginning this new chapter of their lives, career-wise, their lives in general, whatever you want?
Mm-hmm. I went to interview the famous writer James Baldwin. I was at the Boston Globe. I was, very young reporter at the Boston Globe. And the feature editor sent me to interview James Baldwin, who was a visiting writer at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And I mean, I was so nervous, to go interview this icon, this man who, of course, had been at the March on Washington, who knew Martin Luther King Jr. And he was staying on, not far from the campus. And I interviewed him. And at this time, I had not written a single book, but I admired authors like him, who had stories to tell and who cared about the fate of the country. And so the interview went so well that I said to myself, gee, when this is over, I'm going to ask him something personal. And so the interview ended and I said, and excuse me, Mr. Baldwin, can I ask you something personal? And he had this, very jazzy way of talking. He said, sure, baby, what is it? And I said, do you think that someday I will be able to write books? And he was smoking a cigarette and he took a puff on it and he said, how the hell should I know that? I don't know who you are. I don't know what kind of drive you have. Hey, baby, listen, it's hard to write books, man. I mean, why in the world you asked me a question like that? I don't know you. And I dropped my head. I was so embarrassed. Here I had asked this great giant of a man if I, little old Wil Haygood, could write books. And he saw how hurt I was. And he scooted his chair much closer to me and got right up in my face. And he said, hey, baby, tell you what, whatever you do in life, you must go the way your blood beats. And that's what I would tell Bridgewater students. If you're in art, math, or pre-law, or pre-medicine, or dance, or the arts, it's a big, tough world out there, but there's so much room for people who have energy and talent and drive. Whatever you do, you must go the way your blood beats. And that's what I've done in life. And now here I am, 10 books later. Those words from the great James Baldwin hang on my wall. You must go the way your blood beats. And I do believe those soulful words have really guided me through life.
I think those are great words to live by. I'll put those on my wall too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This conversation has been more than amazing, so inspiring. Your work and what you do, I mean, you do it beautifully, you do it eloquently, and as I said before, you tell stories that are so important and so necessary to be told and so deserving of it.
Thank you.
And I'm so excited to hear your endowed lecture and to watch The Butler when we're playing it. And I cannot thank you enough for this.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.